Tonight, as the world celebrates the dawn of 2026, a single phone call from the Kremlin has just plunged the Western alliance into its most dangerous crisis in decades. Vladimir Putin has issued a secret 30-day ultimatum directly to President-elect Donald Trump. Recognize Russia's permanent annexation of Donbas, or watch NATO's eastern flank begin to collapse under a new wave of Russian pressure starting this January. This is not a bluff. This is not a negotiation. This is Putin drawing a red line in blood and forcing America to choose between a controversial peace and the risk of a wider European war. What happens in the next 30 days could redefine global security for generations. And right now, almost no one outside the highest levels of power knows it's even happening. Let me tell you exactly what Putin said in that call, and why NATO commanders are already preparing for the worst. Tonight, we begin with a development that has sent quiet panic through the highest levels of the White House, the Pentagon, and NATO headquarters in Brussels. A development that did not come through official diplomatic channels, not through a public speech, not through a leaked document. It came in a single encrypted late-night phone call from Moscow to Palm Beach, directly from Vladimir Putin to Donald Trump, on the evening of December 30th, 2025. A call that lasted exactly 38 minutes. A call that multiple U.S. intelligence sources now describe as the most consequential conversation between an American president and a Russian leader since the darkest days of the Cold War. And at the center of that conversation was a 30-day ultimatum. Putin laid out his terms with chilling precision. The United States must publicly accept Russia's permanent control over the entirety of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, along with a frozen line of contact that includes all territories currently held by Russian forces, as the non-negotiable foundation for any lasting peace agreement in Ukraine. In exchange, Russia would immediately commit to a full ceasefire, open humanitarian corridors, and begin phased withdrawals from certain frontline positions. But if Trump refuses to recognize Russia's territorial claims within the next 30 days, if Washington continues to insist on Ukraine's 1991 borders as the basis for negotiations, Putin warned that Moscow will interpret that refusal as a green light to resume large-scale offensive operations, not just in eastern Ukraine, but along NATO's eastern flank. He specifically named 3 pressure points: the Suwałki Gap between Poland and Lithuania, increased hybrid operations inside the Baltic states, and a dramatic escalation of Russian military presence in Kaliningrad and Belarus, movements that multiple NATO commanders now confirm have already begun. Senior administration officials briefed on the call say Trump did not immediately accept or reject the terms. Instead, he reportedly told Putin he would need time to consult with his national security team and with President Zelensky. But here's what nobody in the public is being told yet. Putin's ultimatum was not presented as a negotiating position. It was presented as a final take-it-or-leave-it offer. And intelligence analysts who have studied the Kremlin's pattern of behavior say this is exactly how Putin operates when he believes he holds the upper hand. He issues a deadline, watches for hesitation, and then exploits any perceived weakness. The timing is no accident. January 2026 is shaping up to be the decisive month for the future of European security. Trump's inauguration is just weeks away. Newly appointed national security officials are still finding their desks. European allies are anxiously waiting to see whether America's new administration will maintain ironclad commitment to NATO or begin cutting side deals with Moscow. And Putin knows it. That's why the Kremlin has gone suspiciously quiet in public over the past 48 hours. No bombastic New Year speeches, no victory parades, no fiery denunciations of the West on state television. Just silence. And in the world of Kremlin watching, silence like this almost always means one thing: something big is already in motion. Satellite imagery reviewed by U.S. and NATO intelligence in the last 72 hours shows unmistakable signs of Russian military repositioning. Additional Iskander missile battalions moving into Belarus under the cover of winter exercises. Rail transport of heavy armor toward the borders of Estonia and Latvia. reactivation of coastal defense systems in Kaliningrad that had been dormant since the early days of the war. These are not routine movements. These are the kinds of deployments that can shift from defensive posture to offensive readiness in a matter of days. And NATO commanders on the eastern flank are not waiting to find out what comes next. Within hours of learning about Putin's phone call to Trump, the NATO Secretary General quietly initiated emergency consultations under Article 4, the formal mechanism allies use when they believe their security is directly threatened. It was only the 9th time in NATO's 77-year history that Article 4 has been invoked. Meanwhile, in Kyiv, President Zelensky was briefed on the contents of the call early on New Year's morning. His immediate reaction, according to sources close to the Ukrainian leadership, was fury, not at Putin, but at the possibility that the incoming U.S. administration might actually consider accepting Russia's territorial demands as the price of peace. Zelensky has already begun reaching out to European capitals, warning that any deal that rewards Russian aggression with permanent annexation would not bring peace. It would only guarantee the next war. And that next war, he believes, would not stop at Ukraine's borders. Tonight, as the clock begins ticking on Putin's 30-day ultimatum, the question hanging over Washington, Brussels and Kiev is no longer whether peace is possible. It's whether peace on Putin's terms would destroy NATO from the inside faster than any Russian tank column ever could. We'll continue to follow every development as this story unfolds, because the next 30 days may decide not just the fate of Ukraine, but the future of the entire Western alliance. Let's go deeper into what Putin is really testing here, and why so many analysts now believe this 30-day ultimatum is less about Ukraine and more about breaking NATO's will once and for all. Because here's the part that keeps senior Pentagon officials awake at night. Putin didn't just threaten escalation inside Ukraine. He explicitly linked the future of Donbas to the security of NATO's eastern flank. In that December 30th call, according to the detailed readout now circulating inside the U.S. National Security Council, Putin told Trump that if the United States continues to arm Ukraine and insists on full territorial restoration, Russia will be forced to create a permanent sanitary cordon along its western borders. Translation: a demilitarized buffer zone that extends not just through whatever remains of Ukrainian territory, but potentially into NATO member states themselves through hybrid warfare, cyber attacks, sabotage, and proxy militias. He pointed to the Suwałki Gap, the narrow 65-kilometer corridor connecting Poland to Lithuania, as the most vulnerable choke point in NATO's entire defensive line. Cut that corridor, even temporarily, and the 3 Baltic states are effectively isolated from the rest of the alliance. Putin didn't threaten a full-scale invasion. He didn't need to. He simply reminded Trump that Russia now has the capability to make the Suwałki Gap impassable in a matter of hours, using electronic warfare, precision strikes on infrastructure, and Belarusian troop movements that could flood the border under the guise of joint exercises. And he made it clear that if his Donbas terms are rejected, those capabilities will be placed on heightened alert starting in January. Now, look at what's already happening on the ground. In the past week alone, Belarus has announced snap readiness checks for its entire armed forces, the largest since the early days of the Ukraine invasion. Russian rail networks have moved at least 12 additional battalion tactical groups toward Smolensk and Bryansk oblasts, positioning them within striking distance of both Ukraine and the Baltic approaches. And most alarmingly, NATO intelligence has detected the forward deployment of advanced electronic warfare units, the kind that can blind GPS systems, disrupt air traffic control, and paralyze command networks across entire regions. These are not preparations for another push in Donetsk. These are preparations for something broader. European leaders are reading the signals loud and clear. In Warsaw, the Polish government has quietly raised the alert level of its territorial defense forces and begun pre-positioning additional air defense batteries along the Belarusian border. In Vilnius and Riga, Baltic officials have started emergency discussions about invoking Article 4 consultations even before any overt Russian move. And in Berlin, a city that has spent years trying to balance economic ties with Moscow against security commitments to the east, the new defense minister has authorized the immediate deployment of a German brigade to Lithuania, months ahead of schedule. All of this is happening while the world is distracted by New Year celebrations and the upcoming U.S. inauguration. But perhaps the most revealing reaction has come from inside the Kremlin itself. Multiple sources monitoring Russian state media say the usual propaganda drumbeat has gone strangely muted. No triumphant claims about battlefield victories. No fiery talk show panels predicting the imminent fall of Kiev. No recycled footage of hypersonic missiles. Instead, there's an eerie focus on themes of strategic patience and historical justice. Commentators are openly discussing the idea that Russia is prepared to wait, for decades if necessary, for the West to come to terms with a new European security order centered on Moscow's sphere of influence. That kind of messaging doesn't accompany a position of weakness. It accompanies a position of calculated confidence. And that's exactly what has some of the sharpest Kremlin watchers in Washington deeply concerned. They point out that Putin has tried ultimatums before. He issued demands to NATO in December 2021, demanding a rollback of alliance infrastructure in Eastern Europe and guarantees against Ukrainian membership. Those demands were dismissed as non-starters. 3 months later, Russia launched its full-scale invasion. Now, 4 years into a grinding war that has cost Russia hundreds of thousands of casualties and isolated it economically, Putin is trying again, with a new American president who has repeatedly expressed skepticism about endless U.S. support for Ukraine. The difference this time? Putin believes he's negotiating from a position of greater leverage, a battlefield stalemate that favors Russian manpower, a European energy market still vulnerable to disruption, and an incoming American administration that campaigned on ending the war quickly. Whether that calculation is correct remains to be seen. But one thing is already clear. The next 30 days will reveal whether Donald Trump is willing to trade Ukrainian territory for a rapid peace deal, or whether he will draw his own red line and risk direct confrontation with Moscow. And NATO's future hangs in the balance. Because if the United States signals even the slightest willingness to accept Russian annexation as the price of peace, Eastern European allies will immediately begin questioning whether Article 5 is still worth the paper it's written on. Poland, the Baltics, Romania, they didn't join NATO to end up as bargaining chips in a great power deal. And if they start preparing for a future without full American backing, the cracks in the alliance that Putin has spent years trying to exploit will finally begin to show. We're only on day 2 of Putin's 30-day clock, and already the pressure is building. Stay with us as we track every move, every signal, and every closed-door conversation in this unfolding crisis. Because what happens next could change everything. We are now entering the most dangerous phase of Putin's 30-day ultimatum. Behind closed doors, the fracture lines inside NATO are already starting to appear. Late last night, a high-level source inside the North Atlantic Council told us that several Eastern European delegations privately expressed fears that the incoming Trump administration might actually lean toward accepting Putin's terms if it means delivering on the campaign promise to end the war fast. Poland and the Baltic states in particular are furious. One senior diplomat from Vilnius was overheard saying, "If America trades Donbas for a photo-op handshake, then Article 5 becomes meaningless. We will have to look after our own security." Those are not idle words. Quiet contingency planning is already underway in Warsaw and Tallinn for scenarios where U.S. commitment wavers, scenarios that include accelerated rearmament programs, deeper bilateral defense pacts with the UK and France, and even preliminary discussions about European nuclear sharing. Meanwhile, in Washington, the transition team is deeply split. Hardliners around the incoming Secretary of Defense are reportedly pushing Trump to reject Putin's ultimatum outright, to surge new weapons shipments to Ukraine and dare Russia to escalate. But a powerful faction of dealmakers, voices Trump has long trusted, are whispering that recognizing the current lines on the ground could save thousands of lives, slash billions in U.S. spending, and let the president claim a historic foreign policy win in his first month. Trump himself has said nothing publicly, no posts on Truth Social, no off-the-cuff remarks to reporters, just silence from Palm Beach. And that silence is being read in Moscow as encouragement. Overnight, Russian state television aired a cryptic segment showing archival footage of the 1938 Munich Agreement, complete with ominous narration about how great powers sometimes make difficult but realistic decisions to preserve peace. The message was unmistakable. Putin is preparing the Russian public for a deal and preparing them to celebrate the West's capitulation. But here's the twist nobody saw coming. This morning, January 1st, 2026, Ukrainian intelligence intercepted communications suggesting that Russia has already begun mining key highways inside occupied Donbas, roads that would be vital for any phased withdrawal under a genuine ceasefire. In other words, even if Trump signals willingness to talk, Putin may have no intention of giving back an inch of territory he currently holds. It's the ultimate Kremlin play. Lock in permanent gains while dangling the illusion of compromise. Sources in Kyiv say Zelensky is now preparing a dramatic move of his own, one that could upend the entire negotiation before Trump even takes the oath of office. We don't yet know what that move is. We only know that Ukrainian military commanders have been placed on maximum alert, and special operations units have been spotted moving toward the Eastern Front under cover of darkness. The clock is ticking. 29 days remain. Putin is watching to see if Trump blinks. NATO is watching to see if America still stands with its allies. And Zelensky is watching to see if Ukraine will be sold out in a backroom deal. One thing is certain, by the end of this month, the world will look very different. Will NATO emerge from this crisis more unified than ever, having stared down Putin's gambit and held the line? Or will we wake up one morning in late January to discover that the alliance that kept the peace in Europe for 77 years has finally cracked, shattered not by tanks rolling across borders, but by a single phone call and a 30-day deadline? We don't know the answer yet. But the next move is coming soon, very soon. And when it does, we'll be right here bringing you every detail as the most perilous month in modern European history unfolds. Stay with us.